Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be taking a look at the Grekhova Pistol, the only fully automatic pistol here in Black Ops 6 Zombies. We're going to be taking it into Patient 13. We're going to be taking it into the Guardian boss fight, and I'm going to use it both in single wield and dual wield. Now, I'm going to do this episode a little bit different. This is episode 2 of our Ultimate Gun Guide. It was requested a couple times that we do a lot more gameplay and a little less spreadsheet. So we're going to go through with some gameplay. I'm going to talk about the weapon a little bit, and then toward the end of the video here, we'll hop over to the spreadsheet and we'll see where this weapon compares to the other ones that we have tested already. So kicking it off, the very first thing that is blatantly obvious here with this Grekhova pistol is the ammo situation. You only have 60 rounds in your mag, assuming you are using the extended mag 3 on this thing, and that 60 rounds is not getting you very far. The damage is very low with this weapon. It's got a high rate of fire. It's 750 rounds per minute when you're using the single. Obviously you could double that when you're using the dual yield variant. Of course, you're going to be way less accurate, but we'll talk a little bit more about the dual yield here in just a bit. But just that 60 rounds, and you're only dealing, I think, like 39 headshot damage right off the get-go. So even from round 1, you are multiple headshots before you are even taking out an opponent, and you only get 160 rounds in reserve, and you are going to be hitting that ammo crate over and over and over again until you get this weapon pack-a-punch. Now, once you do pack-a-punch it, that ammo problem completely goes away as you get almost 1,000 rounds in reserve and then 120 in your magazine. So that problem does get resolved as soon as you pack-a-punch it, but you don't get a fire rate boost when you do pack-a-punch this weapon. So that is also something to keep in mind, that the fire rate is going to stay the same. So if you want to increase DPS, the only way to do that is to run the rapid fire with this weapon. Now, I do not run the rapid fire because the recoil is so high with this weapon that with the single yield, I am running the recoil springs, which helps a ton to keep this weapon able to be controlled here whenever you're killing these zombies. But let's go ahead, legendary, triple pack this thing and talk about it. Now, something else that you're going to notice with this pistol is there is a massive range fall off, and that happens at just 7.5 meters, and that is while you're using the long barrel as well. So you need to be barrel stuffing these zombies if you're expecting to take them out at all. Your base critical damage with this weapon is only 2,993, and that's when you're up close and barrel stuffing these guys. So even once you're on, say, round 25, 26 here, this weapon is really starting to fall off, and starting to fall off hard. And I think this would be a very difficult weapon to even get to, say, around 36 exfil. And even just shooting this horde right here, just in the video, you can see just how weak this weapon really is. It takes a lot of shots to fight off this horde of zombies here. Like I said, unless you're barrel stuffing, you're not even getting the maximum damage. And your second damage range drop off is only at 20 meters. And that is going to come into effect once we get into Patient 13 here. So let's hop into that boss fight. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind is if you pay attention to these damage values, if you get right up to the edge here, we're able to get 785 damage to the critical spots here on Patient 13, but you've got to be all the way up to the edge there. Otherwise, you are getting 600, and I even had a couple of times where it dropped a little bit below the 600 value as well, depending on where you're fighting and where you're shooting from. But this kind of goes for any weapon here. Patient 13 kind of stays a little bit further away from you, and the further you are staying back away from him, a lot of weapons, you're going to be having a damage fall off. So it is going to be beneficial to you at times when you're able to try to get as close as you can to Patient 13. That way you're dealing the maximum amount of damage that you ultimately can. Now, I did ultimately fail this Patient 13 boss fight with this weapon. Honestly, it wasn't the pistol's fault. We would have gotten this fight done if it wasn't for the constant amalgams during the third phase of this boss fight, and also me losing my dying wish right there because of a lucky spitball by the worms in the background at just the right time, of course, to go ahead and take away my quick revive there from me. So that didn't help cases none either. Okay, now turning our attention to the dual yield version, the akimbo version of this Grekhova pistol. And again, in the early rounds, you're going to see a lot of the same problem here. You're going to have a major ammo problem. Well, yeah, technically you get a little bit more rounds. You still only have the same amount in reserve. And while you can fire one weapon at a time, honestly, that argument to me sometimes doesn't really work out because the hip fire is very inaccurate on this weapon. So just firing one weapon inaccurately versus firing two weapons inaccurately, I would definitely lean more toward firing both of the pistols at the same time. And again, you need to be barrel stuffing. The hipfire spread on these pistols are very, very wide. You can narrow those up a little bit with the steady aim laser, and you can use the deadshot augment as well to narrow that in even further, and which I did do in this gameplay, and isn't a huge help for this. So giving up the dead break in exchange for the tighter hipfire spread once you do eventually get the deadshot daiquiri perk equipped on your weapon here, then that does help a lot with these dual-wield pistols. But again, the ammo problem is solved once you pack-a-punch it. And then once you're legendary triple packed and you've got all of the things on it, honestly, these dual-wield pistols, as long as you're staying relatively close to your zombies here, they're gonna get you easily through around 36 exfil. I do think that they're more than powerful enough to get you to that point in time. You have two pistols that are both firing at 750 rounds per minute. Now you do have a little bit of a reduced damage here, so your base damage with the dual yield is 2400 compared to 2993 for the single yield. But that's only a 500 point difference there, and you've got an extra weapon. And now, granted, it's inherently more inaccurate. However, like I said, if you're staying close, you're going to be hitting most of those shots. The recoil can be a little tough to control. I would say if you're a controller player, this might not be the weapon of choice for you, as this is going to be very difficult. Even more difficult on the controller, because you're not going to get all that dead shot help as well, because you got the dual yield. So you're not really going to get that lock on effect. So maybe if you're a controller, maybe stay away from the dual yield, stick with the single yield if you want to try out this Grekhova. Let's go ahead and take this into the Guardian. Now honestly, I was pleasantly surprised here in this Guardian boss fight with these dual yield Grekhovas. They were doing a pretty decent job, and they were definitely holding their own. Now, having the dual yield and being able to just spray at this guy, and you're relatively fighting him from a pretty close range a lot of the time. I mean, he's usually constantly chasing you around, and you're usually not very far away, so a lot of times you're going to be getting that max damage. I would say most of the time you're going to be in that second damage range, because again, like I said, it's only like 7 meters for that first damage range there. Now ultimately I failed this Guardian boss fight, and you can see it right here, but it was through no fault of these pistols and nothing but my own mistakes here playing. The pistols were actually doing amazing, but once you lose your perks here in this Guardian fight, you're pretty much done. Your time is very limited at that point. You don't have your perks, you're out, just like I was. But the pistols, they did great. So let's hop over to the spreadsheet, and I got some things that you might be pleasantly surprised about. Okay, now let's take a quick look at the single yield and the dual yield Grekhovas. Now, a couple of apologies, there are a few numbers missing here and there from each one. I think I'm missing doppelgas numbers for the single yield, and I'm missing a few things for the dual yield, but we have all the important things here, and eventually I will get all of those numbers input here for you. As far as the fire rate for the dual yield, I do have that at 1500, so that is assuming you are firing both pistols at the same time. So when we take a look at the DPSs, once you have the dead shot and the dead break on here, you can clearly see that the dual yield pistols are doing incredibly higher potential DPS than the single yield. The single yield coming in at 43,211, with the dual yield coming in at 69,300. Now, of course, that is assuming 100% accuracy on these very inaccurate hipfire weapons. But if you are in close and you're in tight and your aim is relatively okay, you're going to be hitting a high percentage of those shots. And in game, using each of these pistols, the dual yield definitely felt better against hordes and everything overall, really, than the single yield. The single yield really felt like it fell off very, very early. It was very difficult to use past round 25 to round 30. It was just not a viable weapon. Whereas with the dual yield, I felt like I was able to survive a little bit longer. Now, what was surprising to me was the Grekhova right here was a little bit better against the amalgams, the single yield versus the dual yield. It didn't feel that way in game, but statistically the single yield is much better, and of course it's going to be much more accurate as well. So just something to keep in mind there when you're comparing the two. And then of course, when we take a look at the boss fight information here, now I do not have the damage values for each one, as we fought Patient 13 with the single yield and we fought the Guardian with the dual yield. But you see, with the Patient 13 fight, we were able to do 9,813 DPS to Patient 13 on average, and against the Guardian with the dual yield, we were able to deal around 21,200. And I'm going to show you in just a minute how that stacks up to the other weapons that we've already tested. So when we go ahead and look at boss fight information against the Siren 9mm and the AS Val that we've already made episodes on here, you can see that the dual yield Grekhovas here are coming in at a much higher DPS than on the Guardian than those other two weapons. And I'm going to be honest, I felt like those dual yield weapons were very, very good against the Guardian boss. I mean, yes, I lost the boss fight, but I already know that was my own personal mistake, and I cost myself my own life, and it certainly was not the weapons. The weapons were doing very, very well. So the Grekhova against the Guardian is a very viable weapon, and I would say if you want to give it a shot, if your goal is to go in and defeat the Guardian, at least so far in this testing, the Grekhova is a great option for that. And even going forward, I think that we're going to see the Grekhova with the dual yield is going to be a standout weapon against the Guardian. And also against Patient 13, the single yield Grekhova, it's not it. It's not even close to the damage that we were doing with the Siren and the AS Val. And I could really feel that in game, and it was a very difficult fight. I ultimately would have defeated Patient 13 if I didn't have to fight the never-ending amalgams during the third and final phase. Ultimately, that's what got me. The weapon's a little bit weak against amalgams, especially when you compare it to these other weapons where, yeah, I'm dealing 75,000 to amalgams here, but you know, these other weapons are dealing 157,000 DPS to amalgams. So that is why we were really struggling during that final phase, and ultimately that's what cost me my life. Just the constant, I couldn't fight Patient 13 and all the amalgams with such a weak weapon all at one time. All right, that's going to go ahead and wrap this one up. If you preferred this format for the gun guide episodes here, then definitely let me know down in the comments. Let me know which weapons that you would like to see featured in upcoming episodes. And I think that this is going to be a pretty successful series especially once we start getting all of these weapons put in and we can really compare apples to apples every single weapon versus anything that you want to do here in Black Ops 6 Zombies. I'm actually super excited about it. It's going to be a whole lot of work to do, especially as we get new maps and new enemy types to keep up with all this, but I'm excited about this series, so hopefully you are as well. And there's my nebula for this weapon. So finally I got that. I'm done with the nebula in this pistol. I do got some work, we got some numbers we got to fill out here yet for it, and I'll get those filled out here in the near future. But thank you so much for watching. My name is Cole Whip, and I'm out.